Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Right, the values that shape Judaism's civil code, lesson number 4, Beyond Personal Freedom. So we live in a free country. It's right there in the national anthem, right? The land of the free, the home of the brave. Yet there have been in this country's past, and to a certain degree, there is even in this country's present, practices, behaviors that may not exactly truly ring as free. There was, of course, was slavery, debt bondage, debt prisons, prison labor, and ultimately issues of employment law. The question could be asked, how free are we, right? Are we really that free? Now, Judaism is going to have a very different take on the concept of freedom, which ultimately is going to translate in a very different set of laws. Now, it's taken, thousands of years for civilized society to begin to catch up with the Jewish perspective on freedom. They haven't fully caught up yet, but we're getting there. Now, to introduce the topic, we got a fascinating video, which I'm hoping will play smoothly.
Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were brutally kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery in the American colonies. By the mid-19th century, however, the United States was fiercely disunited over the practice of slavery. The southern states built their entire economy on the exploitation of people as slaves, whereas the northern states had abolished the practice as a contradiction to the right of every human to be free. This friction led to the Civil War of 1861. But just 4 years shy of the war, and just 8 years before slavery was permanently abolished throughout the United States, a Massachusetts court faced a slavery case with an unusual twist. The defendants were a white couple, Lewis and Laura Sweet, who lived in Nashville, Tennessee, where slavery was still legal and prevalent. During their travels, the Sweets were in the habit of taking along their black slave, a lady by the name of Betty. In 1857, the Sweets toured Canada and various northern states, but when they arrived in Lawrence, a city in the abolitionist state of Massachusetts, they ran into trouble. Local anti-slavery activists recoiled at the sight of a woman of color accompanying her white master and mistress. They demanded that the Sweets set Betty free. The couple claimed that they would not retain Betty against her will, but that Betty was not seeking her freedom. The activists then turned to Betty. They begged her to assert her rights and to refuse to return to Tennessee with the Sweets, but Betty brushed them away. One Lawrence activist, a widow named Lucy Schuyler, petitioned the Boston courts to intervene. The case, referred to simply as Betty's case, was heard by Massachusetts Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw, a deep thinker with considerable influence on the development of American law. Shaw requested the parties' consent to interview Betty in private. He reported,
"I proposed and had an examination of the said Betty, apart from the said Sweet and wife, and all other persons, upon which it appeared to me that she is 25 years old, intelligent, and capable of judging for herself, that she has a husband in Tennessee and other relatives, that she is much attached to Mr. and Mrs. Sweet, is very well treated by them, and desires to remain and return with them, and this desire she expressed decisively, and upon repeated inquiries. I explained to her her right to freedom and protection here, and that she could not lawfully be taken away against her will."
The judge found himself in a quandary. Under the laws of his state, slavery was illegal and wrong. On the other hand, Betty insisted that she wished to remain with her masters. Betty's freedom appeared to be pitted against her free choice. Judge Shaw opted for the free choice argument.
It was contrary to all the principles of freedom that this or any other person should not exercise a free choice in such a matter. Betty was entirely at liberty to exercise her free choice, and no one could interfere with her without incurring a personal liability. Wherefore it was ordered and adjudged that the said Betty be at free liberty to remain with Mr. and Mrs. Sweet, or go elsewhere at her free choice, and that all persons be interdicted and forbidden to interfere with her personal liberty in this respect.
The underlying dilemma of Betty's case rings louder and lingers longer than an individual judge's decision. Should an individual be free to choose to be a slave?
This really is an incredible question. What is the definition of freedom? Would the definition of freedom include the ability for a person to be free to choose to be a slave? How do you get to the bottom of this? How do you answer such a question like that? In order to do so, we need to have a better understanding from a philosophical perspective. What does freedom mean? What does liberty mean? From a philosophical perspective, there are two theories of freedom, two ways to define it, two ways to understand it, two ways to approach it. Approach number one is negative liberty. Negative liberty means you have complete freedom from constraints. There is nothing holding you back, period. This is negative liberty. Then you have positive liberty. Positive liberty is slightly different. It includes everything that negative liberty, but there's a different angle here. There's a different perspective. We're not defining freedom in a negative sense, in that there's nothing that can hold you back. Rather, we're defining freedom as the ability, the opportunity to realize one's purpose, to do something productive, to do something meaningful. So what is freedom really all about? Do we define freedom as a freedom from constraint, freedom from, or do we define freedom as freedom to, the freedom to realize one's purpose? Let's go to text number 2, which is on page 106, and we're going to begin with David tonight.
Okay, two theories of freedom. Negative liberty is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. One has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive liberty is the possibility of acting, or the fact of acting, in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. The idea of distinguishing between a negative and a positive sense of the term liberty goes back to at least Kant, and was examined and defended in depth by Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s and 60s.
So we have now increased either our understanding or our confusion on the ideas of freedom. You can view freedom in the negative sense, it's freedom from. You could view freedom in the positive sense, freedom to. Based on these two different approaches to freedom, how would you apply this to this case of the slave who's choosing to return to slavery? Would you say, based on the principle of freedom from constraints, should she be free to choose slavery? Any thoughts? Go for it. Unmute yourself. Based on the definition of freedom as freedom from constraints, should a person have the freedom to choose slavery? Any thoughts?
Well, in a way, we already have that example in American history, because there were plenty of people who came as indentured servants rather than slaves, people who agreed to be totally constrained for a period of time to pay off a debt or to pay off the cost of passage to the New World or whatever. They weren't slaves in the sense that there was a termination date, but while they were indentured servants, they had the same constraints, and they picked that choice of how to get to America.
So if a person has the right to choose to be an indentured servant, choosing to be a slave is not that much beyond that. It's within that same general sphere.
Well, the difference is perpetuity.
Right. So the difference perhaps is timing, right? The limitations, the amount of time that's on the other end. would you say that the freedom to choose that is more along the lines of negative liberty or positive liberty?
Well, I would say that by making the choice, it's positive liberty.
Positive liberty, yeah.
Anyone want to argue on that point? I'm going to argue on that point if you want. And I believe that the judge, to a certain degree, perhaps was arguing on that point as well. Although, as you'll see, it's not so clear, and the issue can certainly be debated. From the perspective of negative liberty means nothing can hold you back from making any choice that you want, which means you're free to choose slavery. It's up to you because we're not holding you back. If you want to choose slavery, you can choose slavery. From the perspective of positive liberty means freedom to realize one's purpose, higher goals, achievements. There's no way that a person can achieve those goals while constrained, while limited by being chained, so to speak, as a slave. From the perspective of positive liberty, how could a person be free to be a slave? Maybe from the perspective of negative liberty. From the perspective of positive liberty, freedom is much more than just not being locked in a cage. There's a lot more that freedom has. Now, where and why does this get a little bit more complicated? Because who's to say what a person's true purpose is? Perhaps Betty, the slave in this story, felt that her true purpose is to be a slave in Tennessee. Like, how can you, anyone determine that? Who are we to argue? Now, let's go to what the Torah has to say about freedom. Now, is anyone familiar with where in the Torah we may derive some type of principles that relate to freedom? What experience have the Jewish people had that might give us some type of insights into the nature of freedom?
Passover?
Absolutely. The very origin story of the Jewish people, right? Freedom is a foundational Jewish value. The very foundation of our Jewish identity is the story of Pesach, the exodus from Egypt, going from slavery to freedom. Our birth as a nation began once we were liberated. We remember our liberation every day, right? There's a mitzvah to remember the fact that we were slaves in Egypt and that we're free today every single day. It's a cardinal principle of the Jewish faith that we think about, we reflect upon it, that it means something to us absolutely every single day. And then, of course, we dedicate the Seder to celebrating freedom. So perhaps the most widely attended Jewish ritual that there is literally dedicated and focused and centered on the idea of freedom. There is a very famous line in the Torah regarding the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And I want to see if you can guess the conclusion of the line. It begins like this. Moshe says to Paro, "Let my people
Free.
close. Let my people go." Is there any more words that follow that? Oh, louder.
So that they can serve God in the desert.
I hope you heard that. David said, the verse continues, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." We see right from the very beginning that the concept of freedom for the Jewish people, the idea of exodus from slavery, is not just about let my people go, but it's also so that they may serve me. All right, we'll get to this in this. Oh, I think we should feel like we missed this step here. Okay, we didn't miss a step. We'll get to text number 3, then we get to the next question. Karen, could you please read text number 3 on
No
page
person is
108?
No person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah.
So I just made a statement that said, "Let my people go so that they may serve me." That sentence seems like a contradiction. Letting my people go so you could become servants? How exactly does that work? And then we have this statement from Pirkei Avos that says, no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with the Torah. So what does the ethics of our fathers seem to be implying? True freedom is through the laws of the Torah. Go back to the story of the Exodus from Egypt. What is Moses saying? Let my people go. Let my people be free. Why? So they can become servants again. Does this make any sense to you? Does this
Yeah, it's a
idea...
completely different type of serving.
Oh, explain, Karen.
Well, we're not bound to a human person, to a master. We become whole people by serving Hashem.
I would certainly agree, but how would you reconcile the idea that freedom, the way that it's classically understood as no constraints, no limitations, versus this Jewish version of freedom, which has at least 613 biblical laws, plus 7 rabbinic, and we're getting into the billions in various other Jewish laws, rituals, rules, and regulations. Do laws make a person free or not? How does this work? How are we meant to understand it? This all goes back to the concept of negative liberty or positive liberty. If your approach to freedom is negative liberty, that means any rule, any regulation, any constraint on you in any way, you're not free anymore. That's holding you back. However, if you view freedom from the perspective of positive liberty, freedom means you can be the person that you were born to be. Freedom means that you have the ability to achieve the greatest possible potential. In that circumstance and in that scenario, right, a law is not a constraint. A law is not holding you back. Why? Because the laws are putting you in position to fulfill the very purpose for which you were created. In other words, there's lower functions that a human being can do. All you need is freedom for that. But then there are higher functions, higher goals. And that is what the freedom of the Exodus from Egypt was about. Our redemption from slavery in Egypt was not about human rights. It wasn't that we were slaves, therefore we were denied personal agency. Now, of course, it was about that, but it was about so much more. What was let my people go about? So that they can serve me. Living a life of purpose, of meaning, this is what freedom is really all about. All right, let's go to, so the linkage between freedom and Torah goes back to the freedom that makes us a nation. From the perspective of negative liberty, what is freedom all about? It's freedom from the subjugation of the Egyptians. But for what? Here we have the theme of positive liberty. What is positive liberty all about? It's the freedom to live a purposeful life. Right? It is the freedom to be oneself. Let's go to text number 4 and text number 5. Sandy, do you have your book?
Yes.
Please go for text number 4 and 5.
Okay, text number 4. The children of Israel belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am your God. Text number 5. The children of Israel belong to me as servants. With this serve God is saying, with this verse, God is saying, they are my servants, not servants to other servants.
So at first glance, this would all seem to be contradictory. You're being freed from slavery in order to become servants to God with rules and regulations that limit people. Do you not believe me that it limits you? Ever heard of the laws of kosher? Right? Ever heard of the laws of Shabbos? Right? There's some limitations in there. How does this make any sense? The reason that it makes sense is because The Jewish approach and attitude to freedom, the Jewish definition of freedom, is not the negative liberty, it's the positive liberty. True freedom is putting you in the position to be yourself. Give you an example. You have a stone. If a stone does not move, a stone does not grow. Now, a tree does grow, and a tree to a certain degree moves a little bit. If you would try to constrain and to limit, right, a tree to the status and the position of a stone, forbidding it and prohibiting it from its ability to move and to grow, you would be putting that tree in prison, because you are not allowing that tree to be itself. Even though for a rock, the rock is not being constrained, the rock is not being limited at all. The same principle you could apply to an animal. An animal, not only does it grow, but an animal has freedom of movement. If you would tell an animal, I'm going to allow you to be as free, right, as a tree, there's no greater prison, because an animal has to be free to move while a tree does not. Can you try to apply what I just said about a stone, a tree, and an animal to a human being? Okay? Try to use the same logic that I've been using, stone, tree, to an animal, to a human being. Anyone want to give a shot at it?
Well, I think where it starts at least is that we shouldn't be enslaved in the sense of some external force preventing us from freedom. But if we volunteer to take on constraints, then we've made the free choice that is that commitment. And the degree by which we comply with the law is our choice of deciding to be that kind of person.
From the perspective of negative liberty, everything that you said was 100% correct. But if you want to view life from the perspective of positive liberty, that means freedom means something more than just not having limitations placed upon you. So for a tree, right, a tree needs to be free to be a tree, right? An animal, right, needs to be free to be an animal. A human, right, has a different definition of freedom than a cow is going to have. What's free for a cow is not what freedom means for a human being. What does freedom mean to be a human being? Not just that you're not locked up in a cage, but you have the ability to exercise your intellect, right, your emotions, your talents, your abilities, your skills. There's more to freedom than just being locked up. There's a spiritual expression that has to be able to take place. And what we're arguing here is that this is a core element of humanity. And this is a core expression of what it means to be a human being. Not just that you're not in jail. It's more than that. You may recall Rabbi Avrami likes to quote one of his teachers. One of his teachers used to say, are you alive, right, because you're alive? Or are you alive because you weren't hit by a truck? Right? Have you ever heard Rabbi Avrami say that? No. That's exactly this idea over here. A person can be alive just because they weren't hit by a truck yet. But are you really living? Are you really alive? The same argument we're making over here. A person can be free simply because they're not in prison. You happen to not be in prison. Does that mean you're free? Are you exercising your natural abilities, your intellect, your emotions? Now, for the Jew, we're going to make an argument that there are very specific things that we are referring to. And that, of course, is the Torah, which is the argument made in text number 6. Alan, would you like to read text number 6, please, on page 110?
Certainly. Service of God is not something that stifles the identity of a Jew. God forbid. On the contrary, divine service is the very core of every Jew's being. This is the meaning of the sage's teaching, that no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah, even though Torah observance is termed service. Observing Torah and mitzvot is the true nature of a Jew. As the Mishnah teaches, I was created to serve my Creator. Only when serving God is a Jew truly free.
From a Jewish perspective, that which is the most natural to a Jew is Torah and mitzvahs. Right? Every person is created in the image of God, but the Jewish people have a unique relationship with God that is expressed through the 613 mitzvahs. Those exist within us on a soul level. And it's only through the observance of these Torah and mitzvahs can we fully actualize the potential of what it means to be us, and therefore to truly be free. Now, we may experience something similar, not from a religious perspective, but in a different way. For example, Mozart. If you would tell Mozart, right, you are not allowed to ever play music again, can't write it, can't listen to it, no one involved with music forever. Do you think that would be a challenge? For Mozart, would that feel like a prison? Absolutely. Because music to somebody like Mozart affected the very core, the very essence of who they are. That's their identity. To be denied the ability to express themselves in that fashion would be the greatest torture. However, for many other people, right, if they were told they can never write music again or participate in music again, it may not affect them at all. Or at least it might affect them in a very minor fashion, because music is not the core of their identity. So from a Torah perspective, we're saying that for a Jew, Torah and mitzvahs is the core of our identity. Therefore, the ethics of our Pirkei Avos says a Jew cannot be free unless through Torah, right? Because without Torah, we're suppressing, we're hiding, we're concealing a critical part of our identity. This is, again, what positive liberty is about. Being positioned in a way where you could achieve the maximum level of success. And from a Jewish perspective, this is really the definition of freedom. Not so much the negative liberty, although of course that's included, but this element of positive liberty is critical. Let's go to text number 7. Marcus, would you like to read text number 7, please?
Yeah, sure. Slavery is an unnatural state. The natural order of the universe is that animals are under the dominion of humans, but it is against a natural order for a human to be a slave to another human.
So why is Rav Tzadok of Lublin saying it's unnatural for a human to be a slave to another human? Because to be a human being means you can express yourself, you can develop, you can grow. A human being has a soul, an intellect, an emotion, a mind, a heart. For a human to be a slave to another human, this is the greatest imprisonment that there possibly can be. There's nothing more unnatural than that. So Rav Tzadok of Lublin says enslavement to another being is a non-human state. The human state is the ability to produce.
There is a difference, though, I want to say, between beaten as a slave and Jewish intellectual development. I think there are two different, extremely different ends of the road.
Could you elaborate on that, please, Marcus?
Slavery, you're beaten to death as a human being. There is a difference between Jewish intellectual development, such as learning Torah, and being beaten as a slave, as the Egyptians did, or during the Civil War with the slaves.
100%. Right. We are not saying that a person's observance of Torah and mitzvahs puts a person in the position of a slave. We're saying exactly the opposite, which is why choosing to be a slave, right, from a Torah perspective is naturally impossible. Right? When you understand what the definition of a human being is, right, which is not freedom from constraints, If your definition is freedom from constraints, then yes, a human being can choose to do anything and choose to be a slave. But the Jewish definition of freedom is so much deeper because Judaism believes that a person is so much more. Because a person is so much more, then therefore choosing to be a slave cannot be freedom. It's absolute imprisonment. Even if you're removing all constraints, it's absolute imprisonment. Right. Any more questions, comments on this issue before we try to apply this into law? Yes, Phil.
So the Torah has a lot of rules and regulations around slavery. And it seemed to allow slavery early on. How do we reconcile that with the statement that we just read?
That is a fabulous question. So the rules and regulations of slavery in the Torah are unlike any system of slavery that exists anywhere else in the world. I would just want to go briefly through a few of the steps of slavery within the Torah. So number one, from a value perspective, slavery is considered to be something that is abhorrent, right? Repulsive and gross, right? There's no concept, there's no place where you see within the biblical text, within Talmudic law, within Jewish law, that slavery is appropriate or valuable or good on any level. It's absolutely abhorrent. However, the Torah was given at a time in history where slavery was absolutely the norm. And the rules and regulations of slavery were designed to mitigate and deal with this reality. So first of all, it was 100% illegal to capture a free person and make that person a slave. The only circumstance where a person can acquire a slave is if a person was already a slave and you were purchasing them. For a Jew to purchase a non-Jewish slave was a major, major upgrade in the life of that slave. Now, first of all, for a Jew to purchase a non-Jewish slave, it had to be consensual. What do I mean by that? When a non-Jew that is already a slave is purchased by a Jew, that person goes through a partial conversion to Judaism. Conversion to Judaism can only be done willingly. So the person has to agree and of their own free choice to do so. If a person does not want to convert to Judaism, you cannot acquire that person as a slave. So all of a sudden we have an entirely different type of limitation there. Number two, a person who is a slave cannot be mistreated, right? If you murder your slave, you will get the death penalty, right? Absolutely, you'll get the death penalty, right? If you injure your slave, all kinds of injuries, the slave automatically goes free, right? The person is not treated like property in the same way that it was understood in US law. So the rules and regulations are different. You cannot kidnap someone. You can only purchase someone who already was a slave, and that person was essentially agreeing to be Jewish. Not, you weren't 100% Jewish at the time. If you were freed, you would become 100% Jewish. So you were really dealing with a reality at that time and upgrading it, bringing some humanity, bringing some kindness into it. But it was, for all intents and purposes, not a thing. We don't find anywhere in the biblical text where slavery was encouraged or viewed as something positive, not in the Talmudic text. We have exactly the opposite. Slavery is not a Jewish value, yet it did exist in a particular era in time with some degree of humanity from the Torah perspective at the time.
Didn't Joseph bring in the Jewish people at the time to be slaves unto Pharaoh for, I assume, economic reasons, but became abusive later on? Isn't that what Joseph did?
Joseph did not bring the Jews to be slaves to Egypt. There was a tremendous famine, and there was plenty of food in Egypt. So Joseph invited his family to come down to Egypt so they will not starve to death in the land of Israel. After Joseph passed away, the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people, but it was not Joseph who got the Jewish people involved in slavery. All right. Now that we have some understanding of the Jewish perspective on freedom, and that the idea of slavery is anti-human, not just because you're in a cage, because it limits your ability to fully express all the gifts of what being a human being truly means. How does that translate into law? We're going to go to case study A. Alan, if you could read case study A. What page is that on?
112.
Page 112, please. Yes.
Reuben borrowed money from Shimon and failed to repay the loan. Reuben is now living with a relative where he eats good food and dons expensive clothing. His wife is similarly expensively attired and even provides gifts to her friends. Reuben claims that all of this is provided by his relative, whereas he personally is penniless. He sits idle and refuses to engage in any labor or business of the type he always performed in the past, because he knows that any money he earns will necessarily go toward repaying his loan.
How would you judge this case? What would you do to try to extract this money from Reuben? Any thoughts? What would you do? You're in charge, Karen. You are the judge in the case. Reuben is before you. He's wearing fancy clothing. He's living it up, but he claims, oh, it's not mine, right? This is all my brother's. Look at my bank account. I have nothing. I own nothing, and I will do nothing.
Yeah, well, this is common today too. This is, I've seen this, we've all seen this today too. I don't know how, I don't know how, as a judge, I would get Reuben to work because he needs to work.
Let's think of some options that you could do to him. Could you penalize him that, let's say, every day that he's late on the payment, right, he has to pay an extra $100, right?
Well, he's
How
gonna claim I have no money, so I can't pay him anything.
That's not gonna work. Okay. How about forcing him to work? You are now an employee at McDonald's, and you are forced to be there every single day to work to pay back your money.
Well, and the money is docked from his pay. It comes right out. He doesn't even see it.
What about shaming him?
No, I'm saying that could work, that he's
But
forced
he's refusing to work. So you'd have to have some type of system where you force him to work. Historically, they did some of these things. So debt bondage, putting a person in debtor's prison, breaking a few kneecaps, right? These are the type of things that historically governments or private individuals try to do in order to extract payment from people. Now, what does Jewish law have to say, right? From a Torah perspective, Reuven is summoned to a rabbinical court. He is refusing to pay his loan because he says he has no money. He's refusing to work. So that means there's no money coming in the future. What can we do? Let's go to text number 8. Phil, please. Text number 8.
Okay. Scripture establishes that when creditors demand payment of debts and the debtors own assets, the debtor's existential needs must first be provided for, following which the remainder of the debtor's assets are granted to the creditors. If the debtors own no assets, or if their assets are only sufficient to provide for their existential needs, then nothing can be done to debtors, and they may not be imprisoned.
So there's a few points that are made in this text. So how does the law work? If a person owes somebody money and they have possessions in order to repay that, so yes, the court can get involved and extract that payment from you in order to pay those bills. However, the court cannot starve you to death. They cannot take away all of your possessions to the extent that you are penniless, homeless, and will be starving. So how does Jewish debt collection work? All the debtor's essential needs must be covered. All right, so that would obviously have to be evaluated, what the circumstances are, what the situation is. Let's say the court determines that the person does not own anything that we can by law take away from him to repay the debt. Otherwise, the person is going to pass away. So only the remaining assets, right, are going to be granted to the creditor. What happens if the person does not have any assets? What did the law say? Anyone notice?
Well,
Nothing.
Nothing can be done.
Nothing.
exactly.
That is
There is
correct.
no recovery for the creditor.
The person cannot be forced to work to pay off the debt. Now, if the person is working, okay, so then you can garnish wages and so on and so forth. But you cannot force a person to work to pay off the debt. Does the person have a moral obligation to pay the debt? Absolutely. Not just a moral obligation, you have a legal obligation to pay the debt. But if the person does not have any money at the time, as repulsive as this person's behavior is, a Jewish court cannot have the ability to force a person to pay off the debt. Why? Why can we not do that? I think the answer is very simple.
Slavery.
Yes, Judaism does not believe in slavery, right? We cannot force a human being to do work. Forcing someone to work against their will, that is a form of human slavery. Let's go to text number 9. Marcus, please.
Shimon's request that Reuben work in order to repay his debt is not something that the court can compel. The court cannot extend its jurisdiction over Reuben's actual person by compelling him to perform work in order to repay his debt.
So from a religious perspective, a legal perspective, Reuben owes the money. He absolutely should work to pay off the debt. That is his obligation. However, we cannot compel, we cannot force a person to work against their will because it goes contrary to the idea of freedom, which is so ingrained in the very core of Judaism. Now, throughout history, as history progressed, most societies got rid of human slavery. However, forced penal labor still exists. In the year 2022, right? That's the year that we're in right now. If you are in prison, you absolutely can be forced to work against your will. Now, what happens if you refuse to work, right? Let's say you are forced to work in the typical license plate manufacturing department of a prison, okay, if that's still a thing. You refuse, I'm not working. What happens to you?
Solitary.
Solitary confinement. There's absolutely going to be consequences because you are legally able to be forced to work if you're in prison. Now, what do you think the pay is?
Oh, it's like pennies on the dollar.
Absolutely. If you're getting paid, because you're not always getting paid, the compensation is going to be just about nothing. Now, how is this legal? If a person is in prison and you are forced to work in this, you're forced to work at this license plate manufacturing department, and if not, you're in solitary confinement. How is this any different than slavery? Is it any different than slavery? Well, let's go to text.
The curious thing is, on the one hand, you're getting paid something when you perform the labor. There's a compulsion to give some kind of payment for the work, even in the prison situation. And the other curious thing about it is that you wouldn't be in that spot if you hadn't already been convicted of something.
So according to secular law, right, a person who is in prison does not have the same rights as a person who's not in prison. This is the way the Atlantic formulates it in an article about prison labor, text number 10. David, would you like to go for it, please?
Once cleared by the prison doctor, inmates can be forced to work under threat of punishment as severe as solitary confinement. Legally, this labor may be totally uncompensated. More typically, inmates are paid meagerly, as little as 2 cents per hour, for their full-time work in the fields, manufacturing warehouses, or kitchens. How is this legal? Didn't the 13th Amendment abolish all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude in this country? Not quite. In the shining promise of freedom that was the 13th Amendment, a sharp exception was carved out. Section 1 of the amendment provides neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Simply put, incarcerated persons have no constitutional rights in this arena. They can be forced to work as punishment for their crimes.
So in the year 2022, forced labor, which has striking similarities to slavery, is still allowed and is legal. Now, in many societies, a person who was in debt and did not have the ability to pay would be thrown in a debtor's prison until either they or someone else was able to pay their debt or they died. Now, how recent do you think that debtors' prisons operated in the civilized world? When do you think
I'm
most
gonna throw out the
recent?
70s.
Sorry, what was that, Sandy?
I said, I'm gonna throw in maybe even in England, probably the 70s.
Well, let's turn to page 132 and see how close we are to that number. On page 132, we have some information about debtors' prisons. And we see that in Canada, they were abolished in 1849, the United States, 1833, France, 1867, Germany, 1868, England, 1869, Greece, 2008. So as recent as 2008, what we would all describe as a first world country was still operating debtors' prison. These prisons were bad. These prisons were horrible. They're absolutely terrible. Let's go to text number 11 for just a little taste of the debtor's prison. Karen, could you please read text number 11?
The debtors were sent to jail until they were able to pay off their debts. These were called debtors' prisons, a peculiar form of punishment. Indefinite incarceration was the mode of punishment. Sometimes the convicts stayed with their families in the prison. Family members were free to come and go according to their wish. Therefore, even children were born and raised there. The prisons were full of rats, lice, and fleas. The prisoners were denied basic necessities of life, such as food, water, and clothing. It is said that these places were so dirty and filthy that around 25% of the inmates died due to these horrible living conditions. The debtors were imprisoned and tortured at the pleasure of the creditors. When other countries of Europe had legislation limiting the debt imprisonment term to 1 year, England did not have such a law. When in 1842 the Fleet prison was closed, it was found that debtors were there for more than 30 years.
Incredible. In 1824, a Londoner named John Dickens, right, is sentenced to a debtor's prison for his inability to pay back a loan. Now, John Dickens had a son, right? The son's name was Charles Dickens. And he was tremendously traumatized by growing up, living in and being connected to his father, who was in his debtor's prison. He grew up to become quite the famous author, and a theme in many of his novels was about the horrific and cruel nature of these debtor prisons. And his novels actually played a role in grabbing the national attention. And ultimately, the debtors' prisons were abolished in England in 1869. So what does Jewish law have to say, number one, about the forced labor, and number two, about debtor's prison? Now, we did say before that from the perspective of Jewish law, you cannot be forced to work to repay a debt, right? You can't have forced labor. What about imprisonment? From the perspective of Jewish law, can we imprison a person, put them in a debtor's prison to motivate them to pay their debt? What do you think?
But I have a question.
Yes.
If we go back to text 11 and the last sentence there, that there were debtors there for more than 30 years, if they're in prison and they're not working, how are they going to pay off the debt?
That is a fabulous, fabulous question. It does not seem like the best system. It really does not seem like the best system if your goal is to recoup the money. If the goal is to scare the living daylights of anyone else so they would pay their debts, perhaps it was motivating. But I don't know how much was actually recovered as a result of these, debtors' prisons. Let's go to text number 12. The Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshes, very prominent 14th century rabbi. Sandy.
Okay. Am I on? Yes. Inquiry. Reuben borrowed money from Shimon. In the contract, Reuben put up his personal freedom as collateral. For so is the law in Aragon.
This is Spain.
If a debtor does not own available assets from which his debt can be repaid, he is incarcerated.
It continues.
Shimon, the creditor, now, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, continue. Sorry.
Hello?
Yeah, you can continue. I apologize for
Shimon, the
interrupting.
creditor. No, it's fine. I just thought something happened. Shimon, the creditor, now demands the repayment of his loan, but Reuben has no assets from which to pay. Shimon requests that Reuben be imprisoned, as he explicitly agreed to in advance. Reuben argues that he cannot be imprisoned for his debt because there is no precedent in Jewish law for a person to be imprisoned due to a debt. You requested my opinion on the law in such a case. Response. Jewish law sides with Reuben, the debtor. A person cannot consent to be incarcerated. The Torah states, the children of Israel belong to me as servants, from which we derive that they cannot be made servants to other servants. No contract clause can allow for a person to be compelled to work, not even in his regular vocation. It goes without saying that no clause can allow for a person to be incarcerated and made to languish in a dark dungeon.
So the Rivash writes that even though Reuben himself agreed to it, he put it into the contract, right? He signed the contract and he's perfectly willing to do so. The Rivash says absolutely not. All forced labor is banned. Even voluntary forced labor is banned. Jewish law simply will not allow a person to make themselves a slave in this scenario. So debtors, prison, any of this type of stuff is absolutely not going to be an option from the perspective of the Torah, because freedom is such a high value. Right? Any questions before we move on to the topic of employment law? All right, satisfied customers. Now let's look at how this value of freedom would apply to employment law, and specifically in one area. Do workers have the unilateral right to quit? Now, what if quitting will actually cause financial damage to the employee? Does that change anything? Does that affect anything? Let's go to case study B. We got to go back a few pages. Case study B, page 114. Phil, would you like to read this one?
Okay, that's case study B. All right. Mr. Britton signed a contract to work for Mr. Turner for 1 year, for which he would be paid $120 in total, equaling $10 per month. But Britton ceased working after 9 months, and Turner was only able to find a replacement worker for the remaining 3 months for $45, equaling $15 per month. Turner did not pay Britton anything for his uncompleted contract, and Britton sued to collect pay for the work he performed.
So let's look at the questions that are on the bottom of the page over here. We have 3 different options for how much Mr. Britton should be paid under the circumstances. Option number 1 is 0. Britton is in breach of contract. He has forfeited his right to any payments. He was meant to be employed for 12 months. He breached that contract, so therefore throw the whole thing away. He gets 0. Option number 2, he should be paid $90. Britton worked for 9 out of 12 months. He should be paid for the 9 months that he worked, right? You divide up the contract, it's $10 a month. He worked for 9 months. He gets his $90 and he leaves. Option number 3, he gets paid $75. Britton would have been entitled to a pro rata pay of $90, but his breach of contract forced Turner to hire a replacement at greater cost. Turner's loss from the affair totals $15, so this should be deducted from Britton's pay. How much should Mr. Britton receive as payment? What do you think?
75.
$75. Any other thoughts, anyone?
What
There was a
about,
case just like this in Wisconsin in a state Supreme Court where a teacher hired in Sheboygan who commuted from Glendale decided the commute was too difficult. She said that it was a health problem for her to make the commute, and she quit in the middle of the semester. She was some kind of specialist, a speech specialist or whatever, and the school couldn't hire anybody else to finish the term without paying considerably more. It went to the state Supreme Court, and meanwhile, the original teacher took a contract in Glendale for the rest of the school year. Supreme Court decided that they could not force her to work for Sheboygan, but they believed that she might have a health problem, so they wouldn't require her to stop working for Glendale. The school board had asked for the difference in pay for the replacement, and the Supreme Court wouldn't give it to them. So I think what happens here now is the person gets paid for the amount of time they worked, and that's the end of it.
Well, we will look at what it was that was decided in this case, because this was a real case that went in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court and is utilized as a precedent in cases today. Alan, you probably will have a much better knowledge of how these ideas are presented today, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's see what the Torah has to say. And a big part of understanding the case is, does a person have a right to quit or not? If a person does not have a right to quit, then obviously the person is going to be on the hook for any losses that are going to be as a result. If a person does have a right to quit, then things might appear a little bit different. So let's go to text number 13 and see what does the Talmud have to say about quitting. Marcus, you want to go for text number 13?
sure, 1 second.
On page 121.
A worker has the right to withdraw from their employment even in the middle of the working day. The right emerges from the verse, "The children of Israel belong to me as servants," whereby God is stating, "They are my servants, not servants to other servants."
So we see very clear that from the perspective of Jewish law, a person is allowed to quit, right? A person has a right to quit. Why does a person have a right to quit? It's certainly not very nice to quit. Why do you have a right to quit? Because of this value of freedom. The verse here, the children of Israel belong to me as servants, my servants, they cannot be servants to other servants. If a person did not have the right to quit, you would essentially be some form of a slave, something that the Torah does not allow. Let's go now to the question of compensation. So we've established that a Jew has the right to quit, but just because you have the right to quit doesn't mean that there aren't going to be any consequences, right? Are there going to be any consequences? Are there going to be any compensation as a result? Phil, would you like to read text number 14?
Okay, an employee has the right to quit their job, even in the middle of the day, and they are given the upper hand when calculating the pay they are entitled to receive. So this actually happened to me when an employee came in at 1 o'clock and says, I'm quitting, even though they had an obligation for something later in the day. So the quitting employee is entitled to payment for the value of work accomplished before quitting. This remains true even if the market rate for such work has since risen, leaving the employer unable to hire another worker to complete the job with the remainder of the funds. It took us 2 years to replace that employee, by the way.
Oh, wow.
For example, an employee was hired for 8 dinars per day, but quit halfway through the first day. Even if the cost of this particular form of labor has now risen to 12 dinars per day, so that the replacement worker for the second half of the day will charge 6 dinars, the quitting employee must still be paid 4 dinars for the half day of work. We do not protect the employer from having to pay more than the 8 dinars they originally intended to pay by deducting the expense of the replacement workers from the quitting workers' pay, which would leave the latter with only 2 dinars.
So we have a very important principle here, which says a worker can quit at any time without penalty, and he will be paid in full. Why do we have this principle? Because if you're going to penalize the worker, then they're not exactly free to quit at any point in time. There's going to be an element of coercion in their working for you. So therefore, the person can quit at any time without penalty, and the person is absolutely going to be paid in full. So we said here in this text that the employee has the upper hand and will not be penalized. Now, in general, in US law, the employee has the lower hand, which means the person who quit is going to be the one that's at a disadvantage versus the employer. And they're going to be penalized for breaking the contract. In this case that we quoted here, case B, which went before the New Hampshire Supreme Court in 1834, the court ruled that Britain only gets $75 because he's going to have to compensate for the $15 loss that he caused by quitting. So the additional labor cost was going to come out of his pocket.
So very different than Judaism's.
Yes.
Okay.
So Jewish law would state he worked for 9 months, he gets $90, right? Whatever he paid, he worked, he could quit at no time. There's no penalty, he's paid in full. From a secular perspective, at least from that case that was decided by the New Hampshire Supreme Court in 1934, he would be penalized. So he will get paid his $90. However, then $15 is going to be penalized to cover for the loss that he was going to cause his employer by having to hire other workers, right? From a Jewish perspective, we are avoiding any sense of slavery. He gets paid the full $90 based on his contract. Now, anyone have questions, comments, thoughts? How do you feel about that law? Phil?
Well, it feels a little bit odd because you can have different scenarios. So if the person quit and they could not find a replacement that's willing to work, period, then how would the person be punished? There would be no employee that would be hired. In this day and age, we have positions that go unfilled because people just don't want to work or they want to find something else. So then you can't really punish the previous person who quit because you're not paying anything to anybody else anyway. And how does that work? So I don't know if the law would hold in this day and age, and I don't know what, we have unions now that protect employees for these types of reasons, and I'm not sure where the union laws and fair labor relations come into play from the secular perspective.
Alan, do you want to share
Well,
anything?
I think for the most part, employees have to get paid for the work they're performed under current law. As to whether there's a punishment or a compensation to the employer that was quit, usually not, unless there is some very specific individual contract between the employee and the employer that spells out what the damages will be in such a situation. Perhaps the most interesting case I know of, which is actually now mid 1800s in England, there was a famous opera singer who signed to give a performance in London. And the opera company spent a fortune publicizing it, selling tickets, sold out house. She decided she didn't want to perform. She could do better in France. And so she wouldn't perform. Tickets had to be refunded. The opera company sued her for the damages. The court said if she had a contract to be in London singing on day X, and she sang it, we can give a court order prohibiting her from singing anywhere else that day. That's the extent of the offset to the employer. There was no way to prevent her from singing someplace else the day before, the day after, or any other time. A quit is a quit is a quit. Again, there are many individual employment contracts that might give the employer more of an edge, but under normal circumstances, he's just out of luck.
So essentially we have two competing values. We have, number one, the value of freedom, of a person not being forced to work, no coercion, not being a slave. And then we have the value of not causing other people a loss and damage. And ultimately what it comes out to, although we're going to discuss exceptions in a minute, that we are favoring the rights of the individual not to be coerced into labor over the other party. And Jewish law says something quite interesting about it, that as a general rule, you are not allowed to have hatred in your heart towards another Jew. Not allowed. You have to love every person like yourself. You cannot say bad things about other people. You can't gossip. You can't speak lashon hara. However, in this case, Jewish law says you are allowed to, because this person acted in a completely and totally irresponsible, inappropriate, and repulsive way. And yes, from a legal perspective, you can't force a person to work, but that person absolutely caused you damage, and therefore you are able to harbor in your heart some type of negativity that would be totally justified. And you would, in fact, be able to get the word out there, the message out there, that this is not a person to do business with. This is not a person that you want to hire because you can't rely on them. They could quit at the worst possible time and cause you a tremendous amount of loss. So as a general rule, a person can quit at any time without penalty. They're paid in full for the work that they did. You cannot coerce them into labor. However, they did act, their behavior was absolutely wrong, but sometimes that's just life, right? That's tough. You want to have an employee, you don't have an employee, you're out of an employee, and you may now have to pay another employee to do the same job more money than you had planned, more money than you budgeted for. What are some exceptions to this rule? So there are two clear exceptions to the rule. Number one, as we said before, a person is always allowed to quit, but there are certain times where you're going to have the lower hand and there are going to be consequences for your actions. Exception number one, unless doing so will cause the employer irretrievable loss. Now, what do we mean by irretrievable loss, irreversible loss? What if you hire somebody for a job that is absolutely time sensitive? If the person quits in the middle, you are hurting the employer. The employer is going to have to hire somebody right now. If there's no emergency that led to the person quitting that would make the quitting justifiable, Reuven is going to be on the hook for the loss that he incurred. Let's go to text number 15. Karen, would you like to read text number 15?
Sure. If the work was time sensitive and it's, I'm sorry, you said 15, correct?
Yeah, 15.
If the work was time sensitive and its neglect will cause irreversible damage, the quitting employee has the lower hand in the calculation of wages. For example, workers hired to remove flax from the water it was soaking in. If the flax is not punctually removed from the water, it will decay. If there are extenuating circumstances such as illness or the death of a family member, the employee has the right to quit while retaining the upper hand in the calculation of their wages. Absent such circumstances, the employee is given the lower hand when calculating their pay because quitting prematurely may cause the employer an irreversible loss.
So the nature of employment, the economy, workers come and workers go. One day this guy was working for you, another day another person was working for you. So it can be frustrating. It could be inconvenient. Sometimes you're out an employee. Sometimes you have to pay a little more for an employee. Unfortunately, that is the cost of doing business. However, in a circumstance where a person was hired to do a specific job that had a specific time limit, there were various restrictions that were associated with it, and you quitting on that person, right, is essentially harming, damaging that person's business. You're allowed to quit, but there are going to be consequences. So the example that was given here, you're in the middle of a process that revolves this flax, and you're moving it from water. You cannot just quit in the middle of that, right? You can't just quit in the middle. You quitting in the middle is the same thing, right, as literally damaging someone else's property. Can you take a baseball and throw it through someone's window? Of course you can't do that. If you quit in the middle of certain types of jobs, that quitting can be equivalent to a certain degree as throwing a baseball through someone's window. So are you allowed to quit? Yes, you're not a slave. But if you quit in the middle of a job that literally causes a person's money to be wasted and destroyed, you will be on the hook of that person's money. Right? Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, Marcus.
This day and age, you might have a bad employee. He quits, but I think he's got the law on his side when you can't give a bad reference.
If a person quits, you're not allowed to give a bad reference?
I think,
No.
isn't there a legal statute with that?
Yeah, I think so.
I think you can give a truthful reference.
So a truthful reference can mean that you just say what happened?
No, I think you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
What if you can prove it? It's on video. I mean, whatever the person did.
Oh, yeah, in a perfect world, but sometimes
Imagine a scenario where you have some type of business where the employer has to press some type of button, and the back of a truck or something opens, and things start filling up into some type of bin. When the bin is full, you press the button and it stops. So what if the person presses the button, the bin is open, And in the middle, he quits, totally quits. So now everything that was coming out of that truck overflows, breaks, crashes, spills, destroys, causing a person to lose money. Yeah, you have the right to quit, but you literally damaged your property of the business owner, and you're going to be accountable for that. From a perspective of a reference, I would imagine that the boss would be able to write down exactly what happened. Again, from an American legal perspective, I don't know, but from a Torah perspective, 100% you are allowed to say what this employee did, and that may impact the person's employability in the future.
Thank you.
All right,
Good.
what is, yes, someone saying something? All right, we have exception number 2. Exception number 2 relates to whether a person is an employee or an independent contractor. So first of all, what's the difference between a person who is self-employed versus an employee?
Well, I'm an independent contractor, so, and I've been one for 14 years.
So what is the legal distinction between a person who is an employee versus a person who is self-employed, an independent contractor?
I have no rights. I'm just telling you that right now. I got nothing.
A person who is self-employed has autonomy. You can choose if you want to work, if you don't want to work. While a person who is an employee, right, you have a contract that has obligations upon you. You have less freedom, but you do have security in that you have a paycheck coming, every other week.
I mean, I have contracts with some of my clients. So it's not all, I mean, I have obligations to them.
A person certainly has obligations, but the nature of the obligation is different.
Yeah.
From a Torah perspective, the difference between a independent contractor versus an employee is who controls your time. If you're an employee, your boss controls your time. If you're an independent contractor, they control the job, not the time. Right? So that's the difference. The difference is an employee, they own your time, whether it's 9 to 5 for how many weeks. An independent contractor, they're not owning you 9 to 5, it's the job. You have to get this job done. Because a person who is an independent contractor has a lot more freedom already, we're not so worried about coerced labor and things of that nature. When it comes to an employee, we are more particular. So,
Lesson 4.
I thought there was another slide there. Hold on a second. Okay. So what is the exception? The exception is that Jewish law always gives the lower hand to the independent contractor. The independent contractor can quit at any time. However, if he causes more expenses to the owner, those are going to be deducted from his paycheck. Let's go to text number 16. Sandy, would you like to read text number 16?
Sure. The law granting an employee the right to quit does not extend to independent contractors. An employee is protected by the principle implied in the verse. They are my servants, not servants to other servants. But this does not apply to independent contractors, for the contractors serve only themselves.
So if a person is an employee, right, they are hired, they work 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, right? You can quit at any time. And if you do not cause an irreversible loss, even though it might be more expensive to hire new people, there is not going to be a penalty. However, if you're an independent contractor and you were hired to do the job, I hired you for a job, and you didn't do the job, yes, you are going to be held accountable if it causes the other person more money in order to do that job. So to conclude, human societies have struggled with the application of the value of freedom, whether it's actual slavery, whether it's a debtor's bondage, debtor's prison, various issues of employment law, things of this nature. Judaism has a Judaism has a unique perspective, and ultimately what freedom is about, right? It's not that humans ought to be free. Humans must be free, because to be a human being, right, freedom is absolutely essential. This was Moshe's cry to Paro: let my people go so that they may serve me. And this has to be our call today as well. From the perspective of Jewish law, the law will never mandate that a person work against their will. No debt labor, no debt prisons, no forced contracts, generally speaking, no penalties for quitting, as we discussed today.
Lesson 4. Beyond personal freedom. 1. Judaism teaches that true freedom is living the life we were created to live. This requires freedom from human masters and devotion to God as the one true master. 2. In the past, people could be forced into slavery for failing to repay debts. Even today, prisoners can be legally compelled to work. By contrast, Jewish law does not allow for anyone to be compelled to work against their will. 3. Debt prison was another once ubiquitous tool for debt recovery. Jewish law has always banned debt prisons, even when stipulated in a loan agreement. 4. The employer-employee relationship requires an employee to surrender a certain degree of their freedom. Jewish law protects employees from veering too close to slavery by guaranteeing their right to quit mid-contract without penalty, unless doing so would cause the employer irretrievable loss.
All right, next week, we have lesson number 5. If you want to continue learning about this topic, myjli.com/beyondright, classes, lectures, information, articles about the topic. Next Wednesday, June 15th at 6 p.m., we're going to have a special whiskey tasting at the shul from the Milk and Honey Distillery in Israel. So we're going to have a group of people from Milk and Honey. They're going to discuss their history, their background. We're going to taste. We're going to have Romanian sausages from Chicago, and everyone is welcome to attend and then to come to the class in person. So you could be here in my office with David at 7:30 and do the class in person if you like. So an email was sent out today where people can RSVP. Yes, Karen.
How much whiskey are you going to be drinking before class?
It's a great question. Could be the best class ever, you know. We'll find out. So there's food, there's drink, it'll be fun. You can RSVP on the show's website. A link was sent. And also a reminder, every Thursday evening, we have our 30 minutes of Torah study from 7:30 to 8 p.m. on the shul Zoom room. This week, the case against passive parenting. You can't control the result, but you can certainly control the process. So great stuff this Thursday night. All right, any questions, comments on tonight's class? Yes, Karen.
I was just thinking in Israel, when we were hearing the recording, and they were talking, and during our lesson, they were talking about, well, you can't force a prisoner to work. What happens? How does Israel work with the Jewish law as well as secular law regarding prisoners or any of the tonight's lesson?
Israel's legal system follows a very similar to your standard modern secular Western legal system. There was an attempt to make Israel's legal system modeled after Torah law, not the same as Torah law, but at least modeled after it. It was called Mishpat Ivri, and to a certain degree, a person can actually argue in an Israeli court based on Jewish law. You can do that, but on a practical level, it's a modern secular Western legal system, not based on the Torah.
Thank you.
So Mishpat Ivri never really took off.
I think for me, the striking about all this, I mean, yes, all this stuff exists, but it really shouldn't exist, because if we all truly fulfill our mitzvahs and, our Jewish laws, No employee is going to be quitting on an employer, knowingly that they're going to cause harm. You know, we should always strive to do our best.
We absolutely should strive to do our best, and in a perfect world, none of this would be an issue.
Right.
And from a moral, ethical, and religious perspective, a person should honor the contracts that they sign, and a person should not quit in the middle of the term of their employment, especially if it will result in causing their employer to have to spend a little bit more money.
Right.
Life is not always predictable, and sometimes we're put in situations where we have to make choices that aren't always easy. And the Torah ensures that a person has the right to quit, and you will not be coerced to work. You cannot be made into a slave due to the various situations in life. That doesn't mean the Torah is saying you can just quit at any time and it doesn't matter. Like, no, from a religious perspective, that would be totally wrong, right? You signed a contract, right? And you're violating that. But we won't penalize you because you're not a slave.
Right. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Hope you enjoyed. Have a fabulous night, and God willing, we'll see you guys soon. See you next week.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Husky.